also co-founded Olympia BDS, which led to the Olympia Food Co-op boycott that happened a few years ago. So that was probably when I got my most concrete, first strong experience on BDS campaign organizing. I've had this job as national organizer with FOSNA for just 9 months now, so I'm new, and I'm used to sitting in a room with people and organizing and not giving presentations, so I read a lot and it's a little clunky, so bear with me. I thought this workshop's called Power Mapping, and that's one of the tools that we use in these sorts of campaigns, but this talk is it's more broadly what I tried to do was think back to my organizing and from my current organizing with FOSNA and with many, many local groups across the nation, what are sort of the key components that I think lead to a successful campaign? So that's sort of how I've structured this. But to back up for some folks that are new, and I know we've been hearing a lot about this weekend, but in 2005, I'm going to just start from the beginning, Palestinian civil society initiated the global movement for a campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law on Palestinian rights. And BDS, I think, is such a powerful strategy because it allows people of conscience to play an effective role in the Palestinian struggle for justice. For decades, Israel's denied Palestinians their fundamental rights through ethnic cleansing, colonization, racial discrimination, and military occupation. And governments and international bodies have failed to hold Israel accountable. The BDS call urges various forms of economic activism against Israel until it meets its obligations under international law. And they've talked about this quite a bit, but the three demands of the BDS call are an end to the occupation, an end to apartheid, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Those are summarized. And I think many of us know that BDS has been a very important tool of social movements for a really long time. It was used by abolitionists to protest slavery, by civil rights activists to demand an end to segregation in the Montgomery bus boycott in the 60s, by labor organizers to demand collective rights for farm workers, the Great Boycotts, and by global civil society to call for an end to apartheid in South Africa. So 5 components to a successful BDS campaign that I want to talk about. I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned in doing this work thus far is that the work that you do in the beginning is critical. And sometimes it's really, it's tempting because you get a few people together, you figure out what a good target is in your community, and you want to just go public with it and start talking about it. And I think what leads to really successful strategic campaigns is taking at least 6 months to really first make sure you've chosen the right target, that this really is a winnable goal for you, that it's going to provide opportunities to connect with new folks that you haven't organized with before. And so those initial 6 months are incredibly important. So that's sort of the first point I wanted to talk about. And in those first 6 months, these are the types of things that you'll be doing. So research. So you want to select the best target and figure out who the decision makers would be for that particular target. So what type of coalition building could be possible with this target? Think about how you're going to scale up the pressure when doing this campaign. And you want to ask yourself, these are 3 good questions, I think, to think about as you're starting off an effort. Will you build local political power, which is accountable to you as a constituency in an arena where you didn't have it before? So how will this campaign help you to build local political power? Because then you can use that again and again for future campaigns. Are you working towards a common goal with new groups of people that you've not worked with previously? And number 3 is, do you have a clear end goal that is time-bound? Sometimes we want to just go out and protest. We learn of the human rights atrocities being caused by a certain corporation, but to really use our time effectively and to have powerful campaigns, we need to have an end goal, a winnable goal that we have in sight that we're working towards. And then all of our direct action or creative efforts that we put towards it are heading towards that goal. In this work, it's so important to center Palestinian voices and leadership. Mistakes happen when the lives of people a movement is supposed to be supporting are not seen. And because Zionism, as we've heard quite a bit about in this conference, is built on the myth of people without a land for a land without a people, and because its main project is to render the Palestinian experience invisible, we as organizers need to work twice as hard to bring out that experience. And that means making sure that Palestinians are allowed to speak for themselves as much as possible, and that their voice is constantly heard, and most importantly, that they are given real political power in our organizations. So when you're starting out your campaign, think about who's in your community. And I know for some of us that's very difficult. We live in more rural communities or not very diverse communities. But there's, if that's the case, and also often Palestinian folks don't want to be visible because of the increased repression that they will face by being involved in a campaign like this, or perhaps they will be able to get back to Palestine because they've been involved in the campaign. But some ways we can engage is to connect with organizations that are already out there, like American Muslims for Palestine, USPCN, the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, which is based out of DC, the Palestine Youth Movement, and others, to see if they would like to connect or have leadership in the campaign from the get-go. And also when planning events and as you move into further stages in your campaign, making sure that there's as many Palestinians at the mic as possible. And if you're bringing folks from outside the area to speak, to prioritize Palestinians so they can speak about their own liberation in these settings. And also now with technology, as we've seen at this conference, it's incredible how you can have people present at your conference or at your gathering or your event that you couldn't otherwise. So that's a really powerful tool you have to work with. The next piece is coalition building. So our campaigns are only as strong as our allies and coalitions. And some of the BDS targets that we're working with invite natural allies. G4S, which I did a workshop on earlier, is one of those. Because of their involvement, we're focusing on G4S as one of FOSNA's choice targets right now because of their involvement with Israeli prisons. But they're also, what I want to talk about in terms of coalition building with G4S is they're also involved here in the United States. They have the federal contract with ICE detention centers, so they do all the deportation of immigrants. They do all the transportation. And they also run private for-profit prisons in the United States. They run private juvenile facilities, a lot of them in the South, that there's been many lawsuits around all sorts of abuses that are happening in those facilities as well. Working in coalition obviously strengthens our goals, but I also think it makes for better campaigns and for longer term, it helps us to determine the most impactful target that will be best for our communities for the long haul. And I want to give an example. There's a community right now that's working on a G4S campaign led a lot by JVP members, and they found out that their city has a juvenile facility that's city funded, but they contract with G4S to run it. And so initially they were like, all right, let's start this campaign, let's demand that they drop G4S. And then, as they did further research, they realized that within Black and Brown communities, in their community, there have been a lot of organizing against this juvenile facility for many years because of a lot of its abuses. And so they decided, and it's taken them almost a year, but they've been, really getting to know those communities and contributing to their efforts and really having a lot of conversations and figuring out what could it look like to really work collectively together. And they've come up with the idea that instead of just trying to get G4S out, they're going to try to get parts of this juvenile facility to close down, which will cause the contract to decrease with G4S and to replace it with restorative justice. And so they're teaming with restorative justice organizations as well. So, it's serving the purposes of the BDS movement and at the same time, having a really large impact on the community, and they're building coalitions that will be really powerful as we move towards our collective liberation together. So, also working in coalition broadens our educational reach. It allows us to, so power mapping. Power mapping is creating a visual tool which is used by organizers to identify the best individuals to target to promote some social change. And it's using the power of relationships to figure out the best avenue to power. So that's the basic idea. To win a campaign, we need to see the big picture of all of our potential allies, including the people who have the power to give us what we want. And we have to move these decision makers to support us, right? So to get there, we need to really know who they are, how much power they really have, and how we are connected to them so that we can gain access to them and gather their support. So as I said, power mapping is all about relationships, and with the Olympia Food Co-op campaign, I really believe it's what led to our success. That before we even went public, that we were pushing for our co-op to drop Israeli goods. We had 9 Israeli goods that were on the shelves. We really intensely power mapped the board of directors, and we discovered who knew them that we know is supportive of this issue, supportive of Palestine, and has a relationship with them already. And we approached them and we asked them if they would talk to this board member and offer to go and support if they felt that would be useful or not. And it was through, basically lobbying, but through this effort of really taking some time and sitting down and educating people and explaining why and answering their questions and making some changes to our campaign based on their feedback, that when the decision was actually made in the boardroom, we had a pretty good sense of what was going to happen. And with the Olympia Food Co-op, it's a consensus-based organization, so every board member had to agree to the boycott. And we watched it happen because of all of that pre-work we had done for about 9 months in advance of that meeting. So often we think we can go in there and we can just demand it, and the moral compass will lead people to getting on our side. There's so much misinformation out there about this issue, and there's so much money behind providing this other narrative that we've been talking about through the conference, that we really need to be strategic and thoughtful about how we're going to push these campaigns forward. The other piece I want to talk about with power mapping, what I was talking about before was when you're really power mapping the decision makers to figure out how you're going to move them towards the decision that you want. There's also power mapping your whole community and looking at your community and thinking about what are the different constituencies in my community and who are the leaders in those various constituencies. And it's not always the person you would think, the president of some association or the minister of the church, but who within that population has a lot of influence, it's really well respected. And connecting with them and looking at how, when we do the initial mapping, we kind of rate where they are on this issue from our feeling. Are they supportive of these campaigns, or do we need to do a lot of education work to get them there? And by mapping that out and mapping out your community, you can identify people who are strong on your issue and have a lot of power and connection in your community. And in the case of the co-op, we reached out to all the folks that we knew were going to be supportive, that were representatives of those different constituencies, and we armed them with talking points ahead of time, and we talked about our messaging and why we were doing this and what our goals were, so that when the backlash hit right afterwards and there was a lot of misinformation, they could speak to their own communities and let them know, they were already prepared to say, no, this is really why they did it. We met with them, we knew what's going on, and it was a really powerful way to counteract the backlash, which can be very intensive. I'm still a defendant in a lawsuit from the co-op. And then media is another key piece. So we all know that education is a huge part of this work, and I believe you'll find, if you've not already, that a well-organized advocacy campaign like G4S can really increase the reach of your educational efforts, because more people are likely to pay attention to something that's happening in their own community. They feel impacted by it and want to know what's going on. The co-op is doing what? My city is considering this. Sometimes it's easier to engage people than when we're talking about something that they feel they have no impact in. Even though we know with U.S. tech sellers, we actually play a large role in this situation. But what I've seen is it's greatly increased the participation of the events that we were holding. I can give a really concrete example. We had Ali Abumima from the Electronic Intifada come and speak at a community college in our town before the Olympia Food Co-op, the same year of the boycott, but beforehand, and like 30 people came. The boycott occurred, we had it again, and it was like 400 people showed up because they were engaged in such a different way. So often we think we have to do all this education to get to advocacy. I think we need to also think about that advocacy itself is an incredible tool for education. Messaging is critical, really thinking through your messaging and making sure you have a concrete plan and everyone's on board with it. It's important to write press releases for each possible result of a big decision, like if a certain board is considering something that you're putting forward, having the yes it passed and no it didn't press releases ready, because you'll only get media attention within a very short window after something occurs, and you want to be able to frame some of that messaging and get your education out no matter what happens. So really taking the time and being prepared in advance can really pay off. Op-eds are also a really important piece of outreach, and op-eds, and the IMEU, which, how many of you are familiar with IMEU? It's the Institute for Middle East Understanding, and they're an incredible resource, and they're willing to work with you on, they'll read over a press release or give you input on your messaging, and they work with the media around the issues of the Middle East in a wide range of ways, but they're also really interested in supporting folks in writing op-eds in their community about a certain campaign or issue. So, and they have a lot of contacts in cities all over the U.S. because sometimes it's just hard if you don't have the relationship with the journalist to get something in, and they have a lot of those relationships established already. And then also just remembering that media is a finite resource, and so sometimes we want the media at every single thing we do, and really thinking about, okay, this is what our campaign's going to look like over the next year and a half, and these are and we want to sort of scale up attention and energy once you've gone public. So thinking about, what are those big media opportunities, and not trying to get them at everything, but being strategic about that. Next, I was just going to talk about some current campaigns that are going on to plug into. FOSNA is really encouraging municipal campaigns right now, and I've been working with local groups across the country who are working on these types of efforts. Municipal campaigns look two different ways right now that I'm aware of. One is when you look into what your city is investing in or contracting, who the corporation that your city is investing in or contracting with that is involved in human rights abuses and involved in the occupation. So for example, G4S, if you find out that G4S in fact has a contract with your library, oftentimes cities will hire G4S for their library, or you could look at your water board. Sometimes they'll do security for like reservoirs or dams. This is just one example with G4S. But they'll also, the transit board is another place to look. Oftentimes G4S is involved in your transit system. So looking into which corporations your city and these different city bodies have. And then the greatest tool, I think, for seeing if the corporations that your city is working with are problematic, if they are involved in the occupation, is the Investigate website, which you can just Google Investigate and AFSC. It's put out by the American Friends Service Committee, and they have an incredible screen, an investment screen, and you can go page company by company, and they lay out all the human rights violations, the records, and why they've been chosen as a target for the BDS campaign. I think the actual, let me see, I think I have it's investigate.afsc.org is the actual website, but if you Google it, it comes up easily as well. The other way that municipal campaigns are looking right now, a lot of people have taken inspiration by what happened in Portland recently. How many of you have heard about the Occupation Free Portland campaign? Just a few. So what they did there is in 2014, the city of Portland had passed a resolution, a socially responsible investment resolution, that created a body called the Socially Responsible Investment Committee. And this committee mandate was to look at corporations that they're investing in, or that they may consider investigating it, and to see if they truly are socially responsible. What was so unique about this particular resolution is human rights was one of the criteria in the resolution. And so then this body meets every month, and they look at a certain corporation that's either brought by the community or is on the list that the financial department of the city is considering, and determine whether or not it should be put on the do not buy list. And so they're creating this list that they then will not invest in. And I think this is a really powerful model because often if you look at your city's, like the first step would be to see, does your city already have some kind of socially responsible investment policy? And what I found so far doing this work is that often they just have, there's a lot of single issue resolutions left over from previous struggles. So they'll be like, for example, you'll often find don't invest in companies involved in South African apartheid, because many don't care about human rights as you do and would like to see that kind of criteria in place. So that's municipal campaigns. Campaign we're involved in, as I mentioned, this G4S, that's happening at a city level, but also internationally we've been working with a coalition to try to get the UN to drop G4S. We found out that the UN, actually we found out by the person is in the room who discovered at a UN office that there was G4S uniforms, which is very contradictory given G4S human rights records on so many issues. And so, and then found out that the UN actually has over $22 million worth of contracts with G4S. Yeah, it's a lot. And so there's been a campaign trying to focus on putting pressure there. There's been some letters and responses and not a lot of progress aiming at it here in the United States at the New York office, but in Jordan there's actually been organizing in a lot of different countries at their UN, and in Jordan they did succeed in getting G4S dropped from UNICEF. And what was the other? UNHCR. Yes, UNHCR. And then wasn't there even a third just this past week? That I wouldn't know. Okay. So they've been doing a lot of incredible organizing, and I think if we can get more countries to join that, hopefully the UN will change, and that would be a big win. So the next I was going to talk about, and actually, so this is a campaign being led by the American Fringe Service Committee, and it's focused on congressional advocacy, and it's the latest news. I just got this yesterday, so I thought I would print it out and share. The focus of the No Way to Treat a Child campaign is to end Palestinian child detention, and they managed to get Representative Betty McCollum to write a letter. I think it got 19 additional signatures. I think it was last year. I don't know all the details because I don't work on this campaign. But they just recently are starting with a new letter again, and there's even more momentum behind it. And they're going to start distributing it on May 2nd. So that's, right around the corner. The new letter is addressed to President Obama and CC'd to the State Department, and requests that a special envoy for Palestinian children be appointed to conduct a fact-finding mission that will assess the human rights conditions of Palestinian children, particularly at this time of heightened violence and detention of children. And so they're asking folks if they could do some organizing and try to get constituents to meet with their members in Congress to sign on to this Dear Colleague letter. So if you're interested in this, and they have the timeline and information, Jerry's out of Israel's illegal settlements, this effort is a campaign to try to get beneficiaries to stop selling inside the settlements, which is currently happening, and to publicly oppose Israel's occupation and settlements. Though it's run by a group called Vermonters for a Just Peace in Palestine, Israel, and they're really looking to move outside of Vermont and try to get more folks engaged and involved in this effort. And I should mention that each of these groups and their contact information is on a handout over there as well. And the last one that I was going to mention now is the Stolen Homes campaign. Have folks heard about this? This is being led by JVP and several other groups. And it's trying to demand that Airbnb stop renting rooms and vacation houses, this is just outrageous to me, in Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which they're currently doing. There's a few different efforts they have. I think they have a public day of action coming up shortly. And again, the contact information is on that sheet of potential actions.
Individual boycott versus the campaign kind of boycott model?
Totally. I have a strong personal feeling about this. And many of us were. I think it's good. Any individual action, of course, we want to make smart choices for ourselves. But I believe if we're going to make real change, we have to work together. And so it's not so much about whether or not you're buying, because if you look at the amount of products connected with the occupation of Israel in some way, it's humongous. that I think it's much more strategic to put your time into organizing a campaign, working with something that's already happening, like one of these efforts that I mentioned before, because I do think it's us working together collectively that puts pressure. And it's not just one city dropping a contract, right? But it's a lot of cities doing it. So we really need to hone our energies into campaigns. But there's other opinions on that as well. That's just mine. All right, so a quick G4S. So we talked about these things here. I'm going to go right into it. Okay. So G4S is a British-Danish security company. It's one of the largest security companies in the world. It has over 611,000 employees in over 125 countries. In 2014, they reported $11.2 billion in revenues, and more than $1 billion of these revenues came from the management of prisons, juvenile and immigrant detention facilities around the world, transportation of prisoners and detainees, and also electronic tagging and monitoring. In the US, the ankle bracelets that are used are almost always manufactured by G4S. The US arm of G4S, Secure Solutions, so if you are looking for them, you want to look for G4S and Secure Solutions. They were formerly the Wackenhut Corporation, which there's some history working with this corporation as well. The US arm is 20% of the global revenues. And in the US, it provides private security, as you mentioned, to banks, government buildings, nuclear facilities, special events, and also technology for prisons and private security corporations. My voice doesn't quite carry like this does. I'll try. So I covered that. All right. So what is the role of G4S in Palestine? To just go into a little more detail about it, G4S provides equipment and services to illegal Israeli settlements, to the apartheid wall, and to the military more broadly. They install and operate security systems for Israeli prisons where Palestinian political prisoners, including children, are held without trial and subjected to torture. And just this week, or no, this was actually during Palestinian Prisoner Week, Sammy Dune, I don't know if you say that right. Anyway, they're the Palestinian Prisoner Support Network. They're a great organization to know. Their website's really powerful. And they listed these key issues that are facing Palestinian prisoners right now, this month, in Israeli prisons. Solitary confinement. Nearly 20 Palestinians are being held in long-term solitary confinement. They are demanding return to the general population. Administrative detention, that over 700 Palestinians are imprisoned without charge or trial. Under administrative detention, often targeting community leaders and activists. Just in the last few weeks, Al-Quds University, the Arab American University, and other Palestinian universities have been raided by the Israeli occupation forces, and student leaders and activists at Birzeit and Al-Quds and other institutions have been arrested and imprisoned in an attempt to stifle student organizing and activism. And nearly every Palestinian prisoner is subject to what Israel considers legitimate torture and abuse under interrogation, including lengthy periods of being held in painful stress positions, sleep deprivation, sexual threats, threats to family members, and direct beating and physical assaults. The vast majority of children arrested report experiencing physical and psychological torture and abuse at the hands of the Israeli occupation soldiers and intelligence agents. 2000, just the end of last year, there was a letter that came out from Palestinian prisoners from within the prisons and Israeli prisons and detention centers, and it was written to the global boycott movement, and it said, "We send you this letter with appreciation for the leading role of the boycott movement, which is based on a comprehensive moral and human position that rejects injustice and oppression, confronts racism and policies of discrimination based on race, religion, or sex, upholds freedom, human dignity, and values of justice, and seeks to counter, support, and complicity with the Israeli government by international forces." In this context, the international campaign that you lead is demonstrating its effectiveness and growth. And they sent this letter in order to put forward several ideas and proposals. So this is straight from prisoners. highlighting the inclusion of the issue of the prisoners on the agenda of the boycott movement, and hope to enrich and develop our dialogue. And this was their first idea that they put forward, that the security corporations that serve the occupation government bear direct responsibility for the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. The boycott and prosecution of these corporations is a means of protection and defense of the Palestinian people under occupation, who face massacres and one aggression after another. In particular, we emphasize the importance of boycotting the security corporation G4S, which supports the occupation and has established the closest relationship with it, as well as other companies providing similar services in this arena. And as we talked a little bit about before, G4S campaigns provide a huge opportunity for coalition building because of the extent of their abuses in so many different ways. I already talked about immigration and the role they play. It's from a brochure that they have that's specific on the buses. I used to have this, it's outrageous. The title of this brochure is, see if I have it here. The bus no one wants to catch, the end of the road for illegal immigrants. This is there.
What is this?
This is G4S's brochure on the services that they provide for ICE in the United States. Yeah. It's amazing. It's outrageous. Anyway. Okay, so we talked about immigration, labor. So G4S has been implicated in labor rights violations in several of its global sites, including Malawi, Mozambique, South Africa, and many others. With testimonies of racial segregation and poverty wages, the company offers security services to facilities, for example, platinum mines in South Africa, specifically to counter labor unrest, including riot control, undercover operations, intelligence gathering, and canine support. I know. Prisons. In South Africa, the company has extensive business, including the ownership and operation of the second largest private prison in the world. In 2013, after G4S dismissed 330 guards who went on strike, there was a series of inmate revolts and hostage-taking, resulting in a year-long investigation that found out that G4S security teams were using electric shocks, forcibly administering injections of drugs to subdue inmates, and covering up several prisoner deaths following such torture, which prompted a suit by 47 prisoners against the company. In the UK, they outsource a wide range of services, including very similar, the same sort of things you would expect, military, justice, police. They've involved in many abuses, including the death of, many of you may have heard of Jimmy Mubanga, who was killed as he was being deported by G4S guards. They've been accused of improper management of many prisons, overcharging the government for electronic tagging by charging for dead prisoners or prisoners out of the country. In January 2016, staff members of a G4S managed youth offender center in Kent were accused of physical and emotional abuse against several teenagers. And then, as we talked about in the US, they do have contracts with cities to run city prisons, and then they also run many private youth detention facilities. I think it's close to 30 in Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida. And there's also been many of these same sorts of abuse reports and lawsuits here in the United States as well. I wanted to also, in terms of G4S, mention, how many of you read the Black Solidarity Statement with Palestine that came out last year? Did any of you see that? It's a really powerful statement. I suggest you all look it up. They have their own website specific to this statement. And within the statement, it was signed by over 1,000 activists, black activists, artists, scholars, students, and organizations. And this is a small excerpt. As the BDS movement grows, we offer G4S, the world's largest private security company, as a target for further joint struggle. G4S harms thousands of Palestinian political prisoners illegally held in Israel, and hundreds of black and brown youth held in its privatized juvenile prisons in the US. The corporation profits from incarceration and deportation from the US and Palestine to the UK, South Africa, and Australia. We reject notions of security that make any of our groups unsafe and insist no one is free until all of us are. There's been a lot of campaign wins for G4S. Just to highlight a couple quickly, Columbia University in June 2015 divested fully from G4S as part of a new policy prohibiting investing in private prison industry. Many universities have done this or passed resolutions to encouraging their university to do so. In 2014, in May, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation divested from G4S after a year-long activist-led campaign. This is one of their graphics from that. October 2015, the Human Rights Council of the City of Portland, in June 30th, 2015, the United Church of Christ voted in favor of divesting and boycotting of companies complicit in the occupation, including G4S. And then the United Methodist Church divested its pension fund in 2014 as well. And then, as we talked about already, the Human Rights Council of the City of Portland and G4S was one of the companies that they pushed forward for divestment as well. So, on March 9th of this year, G4S announced in an annual report that it will terminate all business in Israel over the next 2 years. They said 12 to 24 months. They also announced they will withdraw from business in youth detention centers in the US and the UK. And I think it speaks a lot to the power of organizing, because in terms of all of G4S abuses, those are the two issues where they're active campaigns currently. And I think it has an impact. So this is a huge announcement and a very positive development, but we continue to focus on G4S because they've made a very similar promise, a little bit of a smaller promise, just involving their involvement in a couple parts of some of the things they're engaged in Israel, and they have not, from everyone on the ground's input, they have not actually withdrawn. So we don't believe it's going to actually happen until they do. And we think now is actually the best time to up this campaign and effort so that they know that just making a statement isn't enough, that we actually expect them to follow through. So, and then we talked about resources. Again, if you go to the FOSNA website, there's a lot of great information. There's a tab called G4S, and you can see all sorts of information. There's a report that FOSNA put together that's like a 40-page report specific to the impact on children in prisons, in Israeli prisons, that I recommend as well as a resource. And then there's a new website that just came out for Palestinian Prisoners Day, just a little bit ago, called G4SFacts.org. And it's not just about Israel Palestine, it's about G4S.